Do you remember the CIA security triad? Confidentiality, integrity, availability? We're going to talk about data backups, and that applies to availability, making sure that company data that is relevant for business processes is available when it's needed. So let's start by talking about why this is such a big deal. Now, I've conducted a lot of security assessments over the years, and there are countless times where, unbelievably, mission-critical servers are not fully backed up. And you're only going to know that that's a problem when it's too late, when you go to restore what you do have and realize it's not enough. Either we don't have the entire configuration backed up, so it takes forever to get a server up and running again, or we don't even have all the data backed up. It's such an easy fix to make sure that we have that backed up in the first place. So, backups increase data availability in the event of a disaster. Now, the backups can be on premises. You might have a backup environment, tape devices that do backups. You might store backups in a safe, ideally a fireproof safe on premises. You might also have backup tapes stored offsite in other physical locations. So I've made recommendations to companies in the past, smaller organizations, such that it's viable to give a copy of backup tapes to trusted employees to store in their home. Now, of course, if it's sensitive data, that might totally be a no-no. But again, you might encrypt your data backups for protection of that data at rest. But it is an option in some cases. Now, also, we could have network storage like network-attached storage devices or storage area networks on our enterprise network where we have backup appliances available. Storing data off-site also means storing it in the public cloud. These days, you can easily configure on-premises servers, like file servers or database servers, to automatically, on a scheduled basis, back their data up to the cloud without intervention from technicians once it's initially configured. That's a good idea because not only is your data backed up, but it's also stored off-site at the same time. In the event of a disaster, a physical disaster like a flood, you don't have to worry about losing data. Now, when you configure backups, you have to think about whether you need to compress them. Now, depending on the volume of data that you're backing up will determine whether or not you really should compress it, especially where you might want to compress it before you transmit it over the internet to be backed up into the cloud. There's only so much time to perform a backup, and over the internet, backing up 1 terabyte of data is going to take many days. So we have to be mindful of that type of option. We've already mentioned you might want to encrypt your backups, and we have to think about the type of backup that we want to run. Now, let's take a look at something called the archive bit, because that relates to the type of backup that we're going to use, which we'll talk about, and it's also how an operating system determines, in fact, that a file does need to be backed up or archived. So that's why it's called the archive bit. So on my computer, I'm going to go into the file system where I am going to right-click on any old file. It doesn't matter. But what I want to do is go into the properties of it. Because in the properties, if I click on Advanced, here, in this particular example, it says File is ready for archiving, and we've got a check mark. So it's ready for archiving. In other words, please back me up. That's what that file is saying. Now, if we use backup software to back that file up, guess what happens? The archive bit is set to be off. Doesn't need to be archived or backed up. It was just done. But then when someone makes a change to that file, that gets turned on automatically. That's a function of the operating system. But many backup systems rely on the archive bit to determine whether or not something really does need to be backed up. Okay, so we can also back up virtual machines. You can create a virtual machine snapshot, which is a point-in-time picture of the state of the virtual machine's configuration and its data. Now, while that's useful, for example, before you make a major change, you might want to be able to roll back, it does not replace actually backing up the data properly. Although snapshots are useful though. Same with custom images you might create. You want to make sure that you have a full proper backup of it. So let's talk about backup types. A full or a copy backup, as you might guess, means that all data is backed up. Now this takes the longest time to execute because you're backing up everything. However, it's the shortest to restore because usually it's contained within one backup set. So for instance, if you're backing up the physical tape media, it ideally will be on one or maybe two backup tapes, but you're not going to have to insert and change through 5 or 6 tapes from throughout the week in order to get all your data back. And that's why we say it's the quickest to restore. So as an example, you might do a full backup weekly, or you might even decide, no, we're going to do ours daily. Depends on the nature of your business and how important that data is. An incremental backup means that only new or modified data since the last incremental backup gets copied. So it's the shortest time to back up, because if I've done a full backup on Saturday, when people come to work Monday, they'll add files, they'll change files. Monday night's backup, if it's incremental, is only going to back up what changed since Saturday night's full backup. So it's the shortest time to back up, but actually the longest to restore. Because after, for example, a week, you've got Saturday's full backup, then you might have incrementals, let's say, for each night. Well, to do a full restore for that whole week, you need that original backup and then every single incremental to get back to a full state. Now, the other type of backup is a differential backup. This means that any data that's new or modified since the last full backup gets included. So let's think about this. If I do a full backup on Saturday, when we do a differential backup Monday night, it's going to pick up everything that changed since Saturday. So far that sounds like our incremental backup example, doesn't it? But it changes on Tuesday. Because Tuesday night's differential backup, if we're doing that every night, will pick up everything that happened on Monday and Tuesday, because it has to include everything since the last full backup. So that's where it's a little bit different than incremental. So this is quicker to restore than incremental, but slower than full, but it is a viable option. So you might use a combination of some of these backup types for different data sources within the enterprise. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how we might apply some of this backup in a Windows 10 environment. How do we configure backups? So here in Windows 10, in my Start menu, I'm going to go ahead and search for Setting, and I'm going to click Settings, because this is one way that I can get to backup. So within here, I can search for the word backup and choose Backup Settings. Now this is going to vary with different versions of Windows, and certainly there are different types of solutions to back up mobile devices and Linux hosts and cloud resources and so on. But the first thing that we would do here is add a drive that we're interested in backing up. So when I go ahead and click that, I have a list of options. For example, in my case, I don't have drive C listed because it knows that that's the operating system volume. But I can back up my drive letter D, which is an internal disk, or F, which in my case is a USB thumb drive. I'm going to choose F. Then I'm going to click More Options underneath. Now when I click More Options, I can be a little more flexible in how I configure what it is that I want to back up. Okay, so in here, I can choose to back up the entire device now by choosing the Backup Now button. I can also schedule this. So under Backup My Files, I can choose to back up every hour, back up every 15 minutes, every 12 hours, whatever suits your requirements. Now, you might remember we talked about a term called the Recovery Point Objective. The RPO, or the Recovery Point Objective, reflects the maximum tolerable amount of data loss an organization can sustain. And that feeds into what we're looking at right now. Because if the RPO is 6 hours, you need to configure backups to be taken at least once every 6 hours to be compliant with the Recovery Point Objective. So in this case, let's say I'll choose every 3 hours. And down below, I can specify the folders that I'm interested in backing up. Maybe I want the whole drive, maybe I want to cherry pick which items. But at any point, once I've configured that setting, it's going to happen automatically. Now at the enterprise level, you usually have backup devices stored centrally. However, we can also do individual backup configurations like we've done here in Windows 10.